Imagine stepping into, a really modern wedding today. The string quartet is playing softly, the guests are seated in perfect little rows, and the couple is standing at the altar holding
Right,
hands.
it's very pristine.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But now, imagine pausing that idyllic scene and, well, replacing the flower arrangements with the severed, bloody halves of a farm animal, and the couple just walking right between them.
Yeah, quite the visual shift there.
Right. I mean, it sounds like the climax of a horror movie. But if you step into the world of the ancient Near East, that visceral, raw intensity wasn't some nightmare. It was actually the reality of making a permanent promise. So, welcome to the Deep Dive. Today, we are taking you on an expedition into the biblical concept of marriage.
And we've pulled together a really fascinating, incredibly diverse stack of material for this one. I mean, we are looking at everything from the theology of conservative family ministries to these intense linguistic analyses of ancient Hebrew and Greek texts.
Yeah, and our mission for you today is to look past all those modern cultural debates, the pristine white dresses and the legal paperwork, and really excavate the historical, linguistic, and theological bedrock of what biblical marriage actually meant in its original context. Okay, let's unpack this. We have to start with the absolute foundation, which takes us all the way back to the core text of Genesis.
What's fascinating here is, well, we instinctively overlay our modern 21st century assumptions onto these ancient texts. And when we do that, we completely miss the rich, genuinely shocking realities operating just beneath the surface.
Right, because we just assume they viewed the world the same way we do.
Exactly. To truly grasp this biblical framework, we have to strip away the modern gloss and look at the original blueprint the text is laying out.
And the sources pointed straight to Genesis 2.24 for that blueprint. This is the famous passage about how a man will leave his father and mother and be united to his wife, and they will become one flesh.
Yeah, that's the core of it.
And one of the theological materials we reviewed uses this incredible metaphor to describe this foundational state. They call marriage a geode. On the outside, a geode just looks like a completely ordinary gray, potato-shaped rock. It looks like every other stone on the ground.
All right, nothing special to look at.
But when you crack it open, the inside is just bursting with this complex, glittering wonder and mystery.
I mean, it's a brilliant way to conceptualize it. The external, everyday, domestic life houses this profound internal architecture. And, well, the language the original writers used to describe that internal architecture is intensely physical.
How so?
So when the English translation says the couple should cleave to one another, the original Hebrew concept there is literally to adhere or to be glued together.
Glued together.
Yeah. The texts are emphasizing that this isn't just some casual, gentle coming together of two independent lives. It is an unbreakable, lifelong fusion that's meant to span across the emotional, intellectual, financial, and physical realms.
Thinking about this whole leave and cleave dynamic, my mind immediately goes to the business world.
Yeah.
I mean, it actually sounds a lot like founding a new startup company.
Oh, that's an interesting way to look at it.
Right, because if you're genuinely going to make a new venture work, you can't just keep working your cushy corporate job from 9 to 5 and, treat the startup as a side hustle.
Yeah, you have to go all in.
Exactly. You have to officially resign. You have to step away from your old structure, which, in this ancient context, is your parents and your family of origin, to fully commit your loyalty and resources to the new unit you're creating.
Right.
But I have to ask, how does viewing this union as a hidden, sacred geode elevate it from just being, a basic domestic arrangement to something actually sacred?
Well, the crucial distinction lies in the timeline of the text. When you dig into the conservative theological commentary in our stack, they highlight that this blueprint of leaving, cleaving, and becoming one flesh was established in Genesis chapter 2.
Okay, so very early on.
Extremely early. That is before the concept of sin or human brokenness ever enters the biblical narrative in chapter 3.
Oh, wow. Wait, so this is happening in what the text considers the pristine pre-fall environment.
Exactly. That changes the entire perspective. For these authors and theologians, this unbreakable, glued-together unity is not viewed as some human tradition that slowly evolved over centuries just for societal convenience or, property management.
Right, it's not a societal invention.
No, it's viewed as a perfect original feature of creation itself. The two becoming one flesh was designed to be an exclusive, permanent reality. To break it was completely unthinkable in that original, flawless context.
So if you're living in the ancient world and you understand that marriage is supposed to be this unbreakable, divinely ordained geode, well, you'd need a pretty serious way to formalize it. because they weren't exactly heading down to the county clerk's office to sign a marriage license and pay a $50 filing fee.
No, definitely not. The historical reality of how they formalized these bonds is gritty and, well, it's really intense. The historical analyses we reviewed make a massive fundamental distinction between a contract and a covenant.
Because today, our modern world operates almost entirely on contracts, right?
Yes. A contract is a legal entity, and it is inherently conditional. It essentially dictates, if you do this specific thing for me, I will do this specific thing for you.
Right. It's a purely transactional relationship. You can just void it if the terms aren't met.
But a covenant, particularly in the ancient Near East, is entirely different. It is profoundly relational and deeply personal. In fact, in ancient Eastern culture, you didn't just make a covenant with someone. The original Hebrew word used is karath, which translates literally to cut. You cut a covenant.
Here's where it gets really interesting. When I was reading through the descriptions of this ritual in our source stack, the sheer intensity of it just completely blew my mind.
Yeah.
They detail a specific multi-step process for this ancient covenant.
Yeah, it was highly ritualized.
Right. So first you exchanged garments, which symbolized completely taking on the other person's identity. Then you exchanged belts. Now, in the ancient world, your belt held your armor together. So exchanging it meant give the other person your strength.
It's all about total vulnerability.
Exactly. Then you exchanged weapons, signaling that you are now each other's ultimate line of defense. And then comes the karath, the cutting.
The cutting was a very visceral, bloody reality. They would literally take animals like a heifer, a goat, or a ram, cut them completely in half, and lay the bloody pieces on the ground opposite each other.
Just right there on the dirt.
Yeah. And then the two parties entering the covenant would walk together through the blood right between the severed halves of the animals.
Listening to this, I just couldn't stop comparing it to a modern prenuptial agreement. I mean, think about what a prenup is. It's basically planning for financial failure. You're sitting down while you're supposedly madly in love and saying, hey, if we end up hating each other and this whole thing collapses, here's exactly who gets the summer house and the dog.
Right, a very sterile contingency plan.
But walking between severed animal halves in an ancient blood covenant, that is planning for a literal curse if you fail. The symbolism of walking through that blood is effectively saying, if I break this oath to you, may what happened to these animals happen to me. So how does this life or death ancient blood oath mentality map onto what we think of as a wedding ceremony today?
Well, if we connect this to the bigger picture, it perfectly illustrates how society has shifted dramatically away from deep, permanent covenantal bonds toward those shallow, transactional contracts you mentioned earlier. The gravity of a blood covenant in marriage wasn't just about keeping people in line through fear.
Right, it wasn't just a scare tactic.
No, it was meant to directly mirror God's permanent, unconditional covenant with humanity. The theological sources highlight a specific moment in Genesis 15 to prove this point. God is making a covenant with Abraham using this exact bloody ritual.
Okay.
But God actually puts Abraham into a deep sleep, and then God, represented by a smoking fire pot and a blazing torch, walks through the severed animal pieces entirely alone.
Oh, wow. So God is taking the potential curse of the broken covenant entirely upon himself. He's saying, even if you fail, I will pay the price.
Exactly. It was a unilateral covenant. The biblical narrative is acknowledging that human beings are fundamentally fallible, so the divine takes full responsibility. Therefore, the blood covenant in human marriage is meant to reflect that staggering level of absolute, unbreakable, sacred commitment.
So it's not a temporary contract you can just opt out of.
Right. It's a binding of two lives to the point of death, mirroring that divine commitment.
Okay, so if you are entering into an intense life or death blood ritual where you are literally staking your existence on this bond, well, you had better be absolutely sure about who is standing opposite you.
That is very true.
And for centuries, our culture has had this deeply ingrained assumption about the roles of the two people entering this union, which brings us to a major linguistic revelation in the sources regarding the creation of Eve.
Oh, yeah. The linguistic deep dive into Genesis 2.18 is truly paradigm shifting. The text describes a situation where God declares that it is not good for man to be alone and sets out to create a solution for that isolation.
And if you open the famous 1611 King James Bible, the translation says God resolves this by making the man a helpmeet. And over the centuries, that specific phrasing kind of degraded in the English language.
It really did.
It morphed into the word helpmate, and it settled into this pervasive cultural idea of the wife being a subordinate assistant. Someone whose primary purpose is just to help the man do his important work.
Well, the linguistic analysis completely dismantles that historical assumption because the original Hebrew phrase used in Genesis is ezer kenegdo.
So what does this all mean?
Let's break down the word ezer first. It appears 21 times in the Hebrew Bible, and it is never, not once, used as a term for a subordinate assistant or an underling.
Wait, really? Not once?
Not once. In fact, 16 of those 21 times. The word ezer refers directly to God acting as the helper of humanity in times of desperate need. Scholars translate ezer as a strong help, a protector, a lifesaver, or even a warrior.
A warrior?
Yes. It implies intervening to save someone who is entirely incapable of saving themselves.
That just blows my mind. We took a word used to describe divine rescue and watered it down to assistant. It almost feels, it's like taking a modern superhero's incredibly powerful equal co-star, stripping away their cape and just referring to them as the office intern.
That's a great analogy.
It just completely neuters the power of the role.
Yeah.
And then you add the second word, kenegdo, to that warrior concept.
Right. So kenegdo translates to in front of him, opposite him, or corresponding to him.
Yeah.
The best way to utilize it is as a mirror image.
A mirror image. Okay.
Yeah, it describes someone who is identical in essence and value, but distinct in their being. So when you put the two ancient words together, ezer kenegdo emphatically implies that the woman was created as a powerful ally and an absolute equal partner. Not a subordinate standing behind him, but a warrior standing face to face with him.
That is so powerful. But how did such a pivotal mistranslation survive for so long? Was it always misunderstood?
Actually, no. The evidence shows this isn't just some modern progressive reinterpretation of the text. The ancient translations maintain this fierce strength. The Greek Septuagint, translated in the 3rd century BCE, used a phrase meaning a vital rescuer corresponding to him.
Oh, wow.
And the 4th century Latin Vulgate, translated by St. Jerome, preserved that exact same dynamic.
It is genuinely staggering that the original Hebrew language had it right, the ancient Greek translators had it right, and the early Latin scholars had it right. But somehow, over the centuries, we ended up with this watered-down helpmate concept. It feels like the original intent was slowly, almost deliberately overwritten.
This raises an important question about how foundational texts are absorbed and filtered by later cultures. The linguistic scholars point out that the biblical texts were introduced to ancient Israelites who lived amidst surrounding cultures with deeply entrenched patriarchal norms.
Right, cultures where women were broadly viewed as inferior creations or property.
Exactly. So the original phrase, ezer kenegdo, was actually a radical, subversive text. It was actively pushing back against the patriarchal status quo of the ancient Near East, demanding a vision of absolute equal partnership.
But I suppose society wasn't ready for that.
No. As that text was filtered through subsequent centuries of translators and societies that still fiercely guarded their patriarchal structures, the powerful warrior and mirror image concepts were slowly softened and domesticated into the English helpmeet.
It is incredible how recovering one single ancient phrase fundamentally changes the entire architecture of the relationship. So we now have this unbreakable blood covenant made between two equal warrior partners. But that still leaves a very practical question. What is the actual mission? What are these two warriors supposed to do together?
Well, to answer that, we have to look at the strict operational parameters defined by the conservative theologians in our source stack. The theological texts we reviewed outline a highly specific, threefold purpose for marriage within the biblical worldview.
And it's really important to note for you listening that our goal here isn't to, endorse this framework or take a side in the modern cultural debate. We're simply mapping out the specific, often rigid boundaries these conservative authors are drawing based on their reading of the text.
Wait, we're just looking at the mechanics of their argument. And for them, the purposes of marriage are strictly defined as companionship, procreation, and redemption or illustration.
Okay, so companionship seems pretty straightforward.
Yeah, companionship loops right back to Genesis 2.18, solving the problem of human isolation. It functions as a refuge. Procreation is rooted in the mandate from Genesis chapter 1 to be fruitful and multiply, viewing the continuation of the human race not just as a biological function, but as a divine command.
And a core feature of the union.
Exactly. But the third purpose, redemption and illustration, is where the theology establishes its most uncompromising boundaries.
Right, because this third pillar relies heavily on the New Testament, specifically Ephesians 5.32. The theological sources argue that human marriage is not just a pragmatic societal arrangement. It is actually meant to be a living, breathing illustration of the gospel message.
Yes. Specifically, it is designed to visually illustrate the relationship between Jesus Christ and his bride, the church.
And because of that specific framework, the conservative essays we're examining explicitly argue that these three purposes require marriage to remain strictly heterosexual and monogamous.
That's right. The theological argument presented by these authors, like Jeffrey R. Kirkland in our stack, is that homosexuality distorts this biblical illustration because it cannot naturally fulfill the procreation mandate. And more importantly for their theology, it cannot represent the distinct complementary dynamic of Christ and the church that the Ephesians text describes.
Listening to this, if you are reading these texts today, you're seeing a highly specific blueprint. My mind immediately goes to tech. I mean, it sounds exactly like a proprietary software ecosystem, like Apple's iOS.
That's an interesting comparison.
So the theology is basically claiming that God is the original software developer. He wrote the foundational code for this operating system, and the developers are stating very clearly that the program only functions properly and safely on one specific set of hardware. If you try to run the code on different hardware or alter the ecosystem, the developers say the system just crashes. It won't compile. It's an incredibly exclusive, rigid blueprint, which obviously creates immense friction with modern societal evolution. So how do these authors reconcile such a rigid, exclusive blueprint with modern societal changes?
To understand how they reconcile that rigidity, you have to look closely at the why driving their theology. For these specific authors, the physical mechanics of the relationship and the gender dynamics are inextricably linked to that grand theological metaphor.
So it's not about what makes the individual happy.
Exactly. It's not primarily about human fulfillment or what individuals desire. It's about what the institution symbolizes to the universe. To alter the human arrangement by changing the gender makeup or the exclusivity is, in their view, to shatter the divine metaphor itself.
Wow.
Yeah, the human marriage is viewed as just a temporary reflection of an eternal, heavenly reality. If you warp the human mirror, you distort the image of God it is meant to reflect to the world.
Okay, so up to this point, we have established these incredibly strict, unyielding theological boundaries built on the Old Testament and conservative doctrine. We have a sacred geode, a visceral blood covenant, equal warriors, and a rigid exclusionary blueprint.
It's a massive structure.
It is. But then the deep dive pivots to the New Testament. Specifically, we look at the historical teachings of Jesus Christ himself, and what he does with all of this ancient foundation is radically subversive.
It is a truly fascinating paradigm shift. Initially, Jesus appears to take a very strict, protective stance on the institution. When he is questioned by religious leaders about divorce, he pushes back hard against the prevailing cultural norms of his day.
Because in that era, the dominant religious school of thought, the House of Hillel, interpreted the law so loosely that a man could legally divorce his wife for something as trivial as burning his dinner or simply finding someone prettier.
Right, which completely strips away the warrior partnership and reduces the woman to disposable property again.
Exactly the opposite of the Ezer Kenegdo.
Precisely. Jesus roundly condemns this casual disposal of the covenant. He dictates that divorce is only permissible for porneia, which translates to sexual immorality. He argues that the incredibly lax divorce laws of the Old Testament were only permitted because of the hardness of heart of the people.
And he points straight back to the Genesis ideal, right? Where God is glued together, let no human being separate.
Yes, so he fiercely defends the geo. He locks the covenant down. But then, almost in the same breath, he completely decenters the entire institution of marriage from the human experience.
Which is just wild to think about. When his own disciples hear his incredibly strict rules on divorce, they are absolutely shocked. They basically say to him, look, if the standard is that uncompromising, it's probably better for us not to marry at all.
And you'd think Jesus would correct them and say, no, marriage is the ultimate goal of human flourishing. But instead, he effectively agrees with them.
He embraces their shock.
He does. He introduces the concept of those who become eunuchs for the kingdom of heaven. He is speaking of individuals who completely abstain from marriage and sexual relationships entirely by choice for the sake of absolute, undistracted devotion to God.
Wait. So after all this talk about unbreakable blood covenants and a beautiful sacred geode, Jesus essentially says, don't get too attached. I mean, it's like spending years meticulously designing and building this gorgeous custom dream house. You pour your blood, sweat, and tears into the foundation. And just as you're moving the furniture in, the architect walks through the front door and says, oh, by the way, this is just a temporary rental. Don't unpack everything.
That's spot on. The temporary nature of it is exactly the point Jesus is making. He declares that the incoming kingdom of heaven demands a sacrifice so total and so consuming that it might require leaving absolutely everything behind. Your possessions, your hometown, and yes, even your foundational family unit.
That's a high cost.
It is. He goes so far as to say that in the afterlife, in the resurrection, human beings will exist like angels, meaning they will be celibate without sexual activity and purely focused on the worship of God.
Which means marriage, for all its intense sacredness and blood rituals, is ultimately completely relative. One of the scholars we read from Emory University, Luke Timothy Johnson, has this great phrase for it. He calls human marriage a quotidian distraction.
A quotidian distraction.
Right, just an everyday, mundane, earthly distraction when compared to the absolute, eternal goal of living in the presence of God.
And that framework synthesizes the apparent contradiction in Jesus' teachings. He isn't saying marriage is inherently bad or flawed. Instead, he is placing God's incoming kingdom so infinitely high above human social structures that even the most sacred, blood-bound, beautifully designed human relationship becomes entirely secondary.
It is merely a way station on a much longer journey.
Exactly. As Johnson points out in his analysis, the demands of this heavenly kingdom are incredibly severe. So we are left down here to muddle through the mud and the mess of our daily lives, trying our best to catch fleeting glimpses of the stars.
Wow. We have really gone on quite the expedition today. We started by cracking open the beautiful hidden geode of Genesis, discovering that Eve was never originally designed to be a subordinate assistant, but an Ezer Kenegdo, a mirror image warrior and lifesaver.
We waded through the visceral life and death reality of ancient blood covenants.
Yeah, and we mapped out the strict, unyielding theological boundaries that demand the institution perfectly mirror Christ and the church. And finally, we saw Jesus radically reframe the entire structure, elevating the kingdom of heaven so high that this ultimate human bond becomes just a temporary shadow of eternity.
You know, the entire journey really highlights how deeply these ancient texts reward a second, closer look. I mean, when you take the time to dig into the original language and understand how a single mistranslated word evolved, or when you face the grisly details of an ancient cultural ritual, it has the power to completely shatter our comfortable modern assumptions.
It really does.
It fundamentally changes our understanding of familiar concepts we thought we already knew perfectly well.
It certainly makes you look at that pristine white wedding dress and the casual legal paperwork a little differently. And it leaves me with one final thought for you to mull over as you go about the rest of your day. We spend so much of our lives today making casual promises. We sign standard conditional contracts. We click agree on terms of service we never read, and we, casually swipe through relationships.
Oh, sure.
But if the biblical concept of marriage was originally designed as a mirror image partnership, sealed with the absolute gravity of a blood covenant, where you're staking your very life on your loyalty, well, how might applying even a fraction of that ancient, uncompromising commitment change the way modern society approaches our everyday promises? Even the promises that have absolutely nothing to do with romance. Something to think about. Thanks for taking the deep dive with us. We'll catch you on the next one.